So about a couple weeks ago or so, I made a video titled SQL versus ORMs versus stored procedures. And let's just say that some of these stored procedure fans didn't quite like what I had to say in it. I don't know, maybe they thought that the video was too subjective. So after reading the wisdom that has been revealed to me from the comment section, I decided to isolate myself and ponder to the universe for about a couple seconds or so, only to come back to my desk to start working on a new video. Here's why stored procedures objectively suck while completely disregarding any personal feelings I have towards them. Now, first of all, I'd like to clarify in which context I am talking about stored procedures, because this commenter over here thought I moved the goalpost by specifying that I am strictly talking about backends calling stored procedures. So if you're new here, hi, my name is Atomic Code and I do web development. Also, who in their right mind would be comparing stored procedures to ORMs if we're not talking about backend development? Now that we got that out of the way, I'd like to also clarify what I mean by subjective. So an example of subjective would be if statements inside of stored procedures look ugly, because one can argue that they actually look beautiful, possibly after undergoing some sort of hypnosis, but yes, it's still subjective.
He hypnotized you so that really ugly girls that you met from then on would, to you, look like supermodels. What?
Now, I'll also be generous by claiming that the difficulty to debug in stored procedures is too subjective, because one can argue that it is merely a skill issue, you just need to get good. Also, I play Dark Souls and program in Rust, by the way. Now that we've clarified all of that, I'd like to introduce you to the three kinds of stored procedures that I've just made up to get my point across. The first kind are the minimalistic procedures. These are procedures that just contain a select statement, perhaps select with joins, or even an insert statement. But so long as these procedures do not contain any sort of loop or conditional logic, then these procedures are essentially the same as if you were to send raw SQL from the backend to the database. Now you can argue that the procedure is still faster, but we're not just aiming for speed here, we're also aiming for scalability. The only problem that I would have with this procedure is that we're kind of splitting the logic between the backend and the database, where if I needed to change what I was selecting, I would need to go to the database as opposed to just changing it on the backend. It's perfectly fine if you do that. This is subjective. I just personally would not do that. Now, the second kind of procedures are the large procedures that do have logic, if statements, and loops. There's just one huge difference, and that is it is not being called by a backend. These are procedures like calculate annual revenue of a company kind of procedure. Somebody wrote it, perhaps he prefers to write procedures, and this procedure is going to be run by a specific employee at a company, or even if a backend is calling it, it is an employee who's calling the API, essentially causing the procedure to run, but the main point is it is not being called by the users. So unless you're quite literally DDoSing yourself like Cloudflare did, you wouldn't need to really worry about this procedure. It's just a procedure to calculate the annual revenue of a company, whatever. Also, if you are DDoSing yourself, I guess you have bigger problems to worry about. Which brings us to the last kind of stored procedures, large procedures that are meant to replace the logic of your backend code. These are procedures that do in fact contain loops and if statements. Now, the problem with these procedures is not the speed of them, because even if we somehow manage to replace the procedure's code with Rust-based code, we still have the main issue, which is scalability on the database. The reason why we archive data is not for speed purposes, but rather scalability purposes. The reason why we have a master database and replicas is not for speed, but rather scalability. The reason why we might even shard a database is not for speed, but rather scalability. Now, I know somebody in the comments is going to be like, well, actually, increasing scalability does in fact increase speed. And I just want to say to you, if you have a database that needs scaling due to CPU usage as opposed to I/O operations, I think the first thing you'd want to do is reduce the amount of time those procedures are running. And the best way to do that is by completely removing the procedure and allowing the code to run on a separate server, freeing up a lot of the CPU usage, allowing your database to only focus on reading and writing. Now, that is objectively speaking, but subjectively we also want to focus on developer experience, including the ease of debugging and not separating the code into separate locations whenever we can. That being said, there are scenarios where we would want to use a stored procedure, for example, whenever we are using a trigger. But when such a scenario arises, I often think to myself, perhaps there is a better way to design my database. Now, granted, that is not always the case, and sometimes you don't have the ability to change the design of a database. Otherwise, you're just going to break a bunch of stuff. But in such a scenario, I would advise you to keep the work of that procedure at a bare minimum. And this is not a scenario because the code is bad. This is a scenario regardless of whether the code is bad. Every coin has two sides, every rose has its thorn, And there are pros and cons to everything. And if the procedure is the best option in that scenario, then you definitely would want to go with the procedure. But from my experience, if I can avoid it, I'll just avoid it. Now I hope I made everything clear in this video, but this commenter over here said I am a junior. Ouch, not gonna even bother showing the name. But hi, if you're new here, my name is Atomic Code. I'm a senior to some and a junior to others. Why don't you click that subscribe button and follow me on my journey while I teach others but also learn. And I do mean learn because I do read all you guys' comments. I enjoyed reading them. Shout out to Forgetful Scholar, the reason I made this video. We had an interesting debate. Also, your manager's right, you should use Entity Framework. That being said, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.